Welcome to Teaching Truth. My name is Glenn Cartwright. For all that Nehemiah was, cupbearer to the king, project manager overseeing the rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem, a visionary leader, a motivator of people, and a humble servant above all of God. For all that Nehemiah was, he was not a shrinking violet. He was not a leader, a person who swept issues under the carpet. Nehemiah addressed issues head on. And today in our reflections, as we continue to look at the open qualities which Nehemiah had in his life, we want today to reflect on the fact that Nehemiah had an open mouth. He had an open mouth. I invite you to turn to Nehemiah chapter 13, for within Nehemiah chapter 13 there are examples of the way in which Nehemiah wisely and well, and for the glory and honour of God, opened his mouth. Let's read God's word together, first of all from Nehemiah chapter 13, verse 6. But while all this was going on, I was not in Jerusalem, for in the 32nd year of Artaxerxes, king of Babylon, I had returned to the king. Some time later, I asked his permission and came back to Jerusalem. Here I learned about the evil thing Elisha had done in providing Tobiah a room in the courts of the house of God. I was greatly displeased and threw all Tobiah's household goods out of the room. I gave orders to purify the rooms, and then I put back into them the equipment of the house of God with the grain offerings and the incense. I also learned that the portions assigned to the Levites had not been given to them, and that all the Levites and singers responsible for the service had gone back to their own fields. So I rebuked the officials and asked them, "Why is the house of God neglected?" Then I called them together and stationed them at their posts. Verse 15. In those days I saw men in Judah treading wine presses on the Sabbath, and bringing in grain and loading it on donkeys, together with wine, grapes, figs, and all other kinds of loads. And they were bringing all this into Jerusalem on the Sabbath. Therefore, I warned them against selling food on that day. Men from Tyre who lived in Jerusalem were bringing in fish and all kinds of merchandise and selling them in Jerusalem on the Sabbath to the people of Judah. I rebuked the nobles of Judah and said to them, "What is this wicked thing you are doing, desecrating the Sabbath day?" Verse 22, Then I commanded the Levites to purify themselves and go guard the gates in order to keep the Sabbath day holy. Moreover, in those days I saw men of Judah who had married women from Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab. Half their children spoke the language of Ashdod or the language of one of the other peoples, and did not know how to speak the language of Judah. I rebuked them and called curses down on them. I beat some of the men and pulled out their hair. I made them take an oath in God's name and said to them, "You are not to give your daughters in marriage to their sons, nor are you to take their daughters in marriage for your sons or for yourselves." Verse 28. One of the sons of Jolada, son of Elisha the high priest, was son-in-law to Sanballat the Horonite, and I drove him away from me. The narrative of Nehemiah chapter 13 is laced with examples of how Nehemiah opened his mouth. opened his mouth to address issues and not to sweep issues under the carpet. Nehemiah warned, Nehemiah rebuked, Nehemiah commanded, Nehemiah drove away. Nehemiah spoke up and sorted things out. And so should we. The late Reverend Jim Graham from Gold Hill Baptist Church, in his book A Past with a Future, talks about how every leader ought to be unafraid of confrontation. And Nehemiah was a leader who was unafraid of confrontation. Jim writes this: confronting difficulty and danger will always be a part of Christian leadership. It will inevitably lead to criticism, misunderstanding, and maybe even worse. It may well cause sleepless nights and tears. It will result in being emotionally drained and pressurize you to the point where you want to resign, retire, or even die. You are a leader under God, writes Jim, and your task is to remain there and fight for the flock. A wise leader keeps his head when everyone around him is losing theirs. Enemies don't tend to be attracted to emaciated, scrawny sheep. They are attracted to a large flock of well-fed specimens who bear witness to good nourishment in good pastures and beside still waters. The more evidence there is of the blessing of God among the flock, the more likely is the enemy to take notice and make his move and steal what doesn't belong to him. Every leader is unafraid of confrontation. Nehemiah spoke out when things were not right. And we need too to be unafraid of confrontation and to speak out when things are not right. To call out that which is inappropriate and not succumb to being a shrinking violet who is unafraid to open his or her mouth and take a stand for God. I'm reminded of the late Pastor James McConnell of Whitewell Metropolitan Tabernacle in Belfast, and the court case in which he was involved, which revolved around the issue of free speech, following a sermon which he preached in his church. Pastor McConnell could have accepted a warning from the police over comments he made in the sermon, but he refused. He was strong in his personal stand and in his belief, and because of that, he landed in court. The pastor argued in court that he never intended to provoke, hurt, or offend anyone, but he remained unrepentant for his words and said he was ready to go to prison for his beliefs. In the end, his right to freedom of speech and religion was upheld as District Judge Liam McNally ruled the pastor was not guilty of both charges against him. But notwithstanding that, Pastor McConnell vowed to continue to preach the gospel without fear or favour and to ignore the judge's plea that he be more careful with his words. And in an interview with Stephen Nolan, the TV presenter from Northern Ireland, he said this, quote, "I'm preaching God's word. I believe God's word with all my heart, and no way will I shut my mouth. I will stand up for Christ and I will proclaim the gospel. I'm not shutting my mouth for anybody, not even the Deputy First Minister." Nehemiah was a man like that. Nehemiah didn't shut his mouth for anybody, not even King Artaxerxes. Nehemiah had that characteristic, that quality of having that open mouth, the character to stand up and to speak up for God and for Christ. May we have that Nehemiah-like quality to be those people who have character, who stand up and speak up for Christ, who are not shrinking violets, who are not afraid of confrontation, who do not sweep issues under the carpet. But we are those people who have an open mouth, a mouth that is filled with God's words to address the issues that God is concerned about, that in all we say, we may do it for the glory of God and to honour him, just as Nehemiah did.